All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. This is Left Bank Books welcomes political journalist Eric Garcia, who will discuss his new highly anticipated book, We Are Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation. Today, Garcia will be in conversation with St. Louis Public Radio's political correspondent, Jason Rosenbaum. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Eric and Jason, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We offer in-store shopping, curbside pickup, and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for all of your friends at left-bank.com. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating, and it allows us to keep this event series going. So thank you so much for your support. I'm Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event, towards the end of the hour. So you can type your questions as a comment, and you can do that at any point in time throughout the event as the question comes to mind. Be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook and YouTube to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. And now about today's book. We Are Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation. This book is a message from autistic people to their parents, friends, teachers, coworkers, and doctors, showing what life is like on the spectrum. It's also my love letter to autistic people. For too long, we have been forced to navigate a world where all the road signs are written in another language. With a reporter's eye and an insider's perspective, Eric Garcia shows what it's like to be autistic across America. Garcia began writing about autism because he was frustrated by the media's coverage of it. The myths about that the disorder is caused by vaccines, the narrow portrayals of autistic people as white men working in Silicon Valley. His own life as an autistic person didn't look anything like that. He is Latino, a graduate of the University of North Carolina, and works as a journalist covering politics in Washington, D.C. Garcia realized he needed to put into writing what so many autistic people have been saying for years. Autism is a part of their identity. They don't need to be fixed. In We're Not Broken, Garcia uses his own life as a springboard to discuss the social and political gaps that exist in supporting those on the spectrum. From education to healthcare, he explores how autistic people wrestle with systems that were not built with them in mind. At the same time, he shares the experiences of all types of autistic people, from those with higher support needs to autistic people of color to those in the LGBTQ plus community. In doing so, Garcia gives his community a platform to articulate their own needs rather than having others speak for them, which has been the standard for far too long. Steve Silberman, the New York Times best-selling author of Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity, says, We're Not Broken is a landmark book at a crucial moment in history when autistic people are finally being recognized as the ultimate authority on their own lives. Surveying the whole autism landscape, from federal policy to intimate relationships, with heart, insight, and wit, Garcia's book will inspire generations of people on the spectrum to realize their fullest potential. And Ron Fournier, the New York Times bestselling author and journalist, says, a bold and progressive exploration of autism in America today. We're Not Broken is an instant classic. Whether it's demystifying policy or profiling the next generation of autistic leaders, Garcia's story is guided by a simple principle. Let autistic people articulate their own needs. In that way, to read this book is to listen to them. And now about today's speakers. Eric Garcia is a journalist based in Washington, D.C. Previously, he was an assistant editor at the Washington Post's Outlook section and an associate editor at The Hill, as well as a correspondent for National Journal, Market Watch, and Roll Call. He has also written for The Daily Beast, The New Republic, and Salon.com. Garcia is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and today he will be in conversation with Jason Rosenbaum. Jason is St. Louis Public Radio's political correspondent. Since becoming a professional journalist in 2006, Rosenbaum has extensively covered local, state, and federal politics for an array of publications, including the Columbia Daily Tribune, the St. Louis Beacon, and Missouri Lawyers Media. Rosenbaum has filed more than 35 feature stories for shows like Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and Marketplace, and he's extensively reported on the aftermath of Michael Brown's shooting death in Ferguson and the fall of Eric Greitens from the Missouri governorship. Rosenbaum is an adjunct professor at Washington University in St. Louis, where he teaches a class on news radio reporting and podcasting, and he resides in Richmond Heights with his wife and 2 sons. And now, without further ado, if you would please help me in warmly welcoming our fantastic guests for the evening, for the day, we have Eric Garcia and Jason Rosenbaum. Hello.
Hi, how are you doing?
Doing really well. Thank you so much for joining us today. Joining us from the Capitol of all places.
Yeah. I was just saying, hello from the 3rd floor of the U.S. Capitol.
You are the first author that has joined us from there. So,
well, Eric, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about your truly amazing book. And as Shane mentioned, it really is a groundbreaking book, because one of the core contentions about We're Not Broken is that autistic people should articulate what they want instead of others like their parents speaking for them. And I'm curious how well this message has been received, since, as you explain in the book, surrogates as opposed to autistic people have dominated the conversation about autism for many, many years.
It's been really well received, I think, for the most part. I think a lot of people recognize that autistic people are the ultimate and definitive authorities in their lives. At the same time, there have been some parents, I try to make it a point to not just read the professional review, to read like what regular people are saying. There's some parents who say that, well, my son or daughter has difficulty speaking or difficulty communicating, so they can't necessarily articulate their needs. To which my response is that, even if it's just the most basic things, like if your kid is having a meltdown, that's them communicating to you. That's them articulating their needs to you, because they are having a traumatic response to their environment around them. And in the same respect, I think that my argument has also been that autistic people like a lot of autistic people who are considered low functioning have the capacity to speak for themselves. We just haven't listened to them for a lot of times. A lot of times we don't get the communication devices or other types of facilitated communication. And the other thing is that plenty of autistic people like myself have a lot more in common with autistic people who may need higher support, who may require more support. But for the most part, I think it's been pretty positive.
And I wanted to touch on that exact point about what I feel is like one of the most important takeaways of your book, and there's many important takeaways, which we're going to get to. But I think you really try to push back against this idea about high functioning and low functioning autism, and basically insinuating that this perception is dangerous because it provides this idea that somebody has more value than others based on their support needs. I want you to walk me through why that is an important point and why it's dangerous this has manifested itself in society.
Yeah, so this really goes back to, I think, really the beginning of perceptions about autism, going back to Nazi-occupied Vienna when Hans Asperger was arguing and researching autism. And later on, we realized that he was sending some of these kids to these institutions where they were being killed. But I think what it does is that it says that it creates almost this kind of tiered brackets. And it says that, well, there are these autistic people who are quote unquote low functioning, so we don't need to expect that much from them. And either what happens with them is that we allocate all our resources to them at the expense of quote unquote high functioning people, and we become really paternalistic toward them, or we wind up saying that, well, they're low functioning, so we can't really expect much from them, so we're not going to spend that much money on them. Conversely, I think when you talk about high functioning autistic people, what happens is that it flattens their experience and it says that, oh, well, they're quote unquote high functioning, so we don't need to spend that much money on them, or we don't need to give that many accommodations for them because they seem fine. I was talking with a parent in here in the United States, and I think somewhere in Illinois, I forget where exactly, but they were asking me, why should my adult daughter get diagnosed? Aren't they going to use that as a crutch? Never mind that crutches can be good for people. Are they going to use it as an excuse? They seem perfectly fine. Why should I diagnose them? And my response to that is that having a diagnosis allows you to know what you're working with. And for many years, a lot of autistic people, particularly women, don't realize that they're autistic. And a lot of times they try to navigate the world as neurotypical people. But I think the other thing is that a lot of times what it might do is that if you say that someone's high functioning, it might lead to people focusing only on those high, quote unquote, high functioning people and not enough on people with higher support needs. So rather what I tend to prefer to use is I tend to prefer to use terms like higher support needs, which is for people who may need help around the clock, who might need facilitated communication, assistive communication devices, who might need medicated home and community-based services, and lower support needs, autistic people who might be people like myself, or people who maybe don't need help around the clock, but maybe need some supports or some accommodations. Because then what it does is that ultimately you're describing what they need rather than how the world perceives them, which is what I think functioning labels do.
I want to talk a little bit about the tensions of being a self-advocate, because I recently asked a Missouri lawmaker who is gay whether people who identify as part of the LGBTQ community get tired of being the de facto spokespeople whenever there's a controversy around gay rights popping up. And he said, no, I got into this business wanting to advocate for that community. But you kind of get into this tension really early in the book when you talk to a Pennsylvania state legislator who is one of the few autistic state lawmakers in the country. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm paraphrasing here. It seems that she wants to be known as a well-rounded legislator who happens to be autistic rather than the autistic legislator. So I want you to talk about this tension that a lot of prominent autistic people have about wanting to be self-advocates, but not wanting to be pigeonholed as just the autistic X or Y, basically.
Right. So I think it's important to remember that Jessica Benham, she's now a state legislator. She won her election. And I was actually I was on a panel with her last night. So I got some fresh meat for you, Jason. So I think that one of the things that she says is that every issue is a disability issue. So yes, and I think it's different because as a state legislator, her job is to represent multiple people, and her job is to represent people who are not autistic and who are autistic. Whereas I think that for someone like myself, or someone who, so I don't consider myself an advocate, but I consider myself a journalist who covers it. I think that I still think that whenever these types of things pop up, it's important for people like myself to step forward and write about it or cover this event or include autistic voices, because we have the know-how and the wherewithal. And in the same way, I think that people like Jessica Benham, who are state legislators, or disabled activists, or disabled people who work in different administrations, can bring forward themselves and can say, this is what the disability community is saying, this is what they're articulating, this is what they say they need. So it's not necessarily being single issue people, but it's bringing their experience and bringing the knowledge that they have as disabled people and as autistic people to any conversation and discussion, to make sure that they're not being excluded or they're not being forgotten about, or people aren't talking over them.
So when you cover federal politics in Washington, D.C., what do you think influences elected leaders about what they say and do about how autistic people should be treated?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think what happens is that politicians are only as good, and elected officials are only as good as the information that gets to them. So what has happened is that for a long time, parents, and I'd argue they still are, they're seen as the de facto experts, or researchers or clinicians. And what that does is that dictates what policy is. So, but I think what's happened over time is that the first generation of autistic people who benefited from the Americans with Disabilities Act and who benefited from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and who also benefited from expanding diagnostic criteria, as this was happening in the 80s and 90s. They're growing up now. So I think now what you're seeing is autistic people are able to shape their own narratives, and they're able to advocate for themselves, and they're able to advise politicians and speak to politicians about their own experiences, to the extent that many Democratic presidential candidates this last cycle, and we can talk about this later, advised many of the disability policy proposals. I'm sure you saw during the presidential campaign, plenty of Democratic presidential candidates, except for Joe Biden, until released these comprehensive disability policies. And it was a real landmark that they consulted with autistic people while creating it. So I think that what you're seeing now is you're seeing that kind of, I talk about I don't want to pit parents with autistic people, because a lot of times their interests are the same. But I think what happens is that a lot of older organizations that maybe didn't have autistic voices are now finding that autistic people are speaking out and saying where there were holes in their arguments. And they might take a little bit of umbrage with that. And then also now, I think a lot of autistic people who previously weren't being consulted are now have the means and the political capital to speak out, so that their voice is taken seriously in ways that I don't think it was even 10 years ago.
Yeah, let's talk about what happened 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, in your book and in a lot of really fabulous interviews you've done, you point out that it was really mainstream for high-level politicians to talk about curing and eliminating autism. Like Barack Obama used that language a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm just, what do you think was the turning point where the idea of seeing autism as something to be cured was decisively challenged by people who felt the solution was remaking the world for autistic people? Like, what do you think was the turning point where that type of language became unacceptable, especially in democratic politics?
I think that it started, the real kind of tinder and kindling was begun in the 1990s with people like Jim Sinclair and Donna Williams. But it really begins, I think, in earnest when a lot of autistic self-advocates, when groups like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network were formed, groups like the Autism Women and Non-Binary Network were formed. And what happened is that on top of that, a lot of these advocates eventually joined the federal government. So Arina Iman, who was the founder of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, was the first openly autistic presidential appointee in the Obama administration. On top of that, you saw John Marble was the second openly autistic appointee in the presidential administration, the same administration, the Obama administration. So what happened is you simultaneously saw autistic people gaining real tangible political power. At the same time, autistic self-advocates were now growing up. They were graduated from college, or they were college students at the time, and they could talk to their state, and could talk to their representatives, or their members of Congress, or their senators, and they could really articulate. They could really speak out in a way. And I think that you started to see that in 2016. But what really changes it, and I read about this a little bit. I didn't get to go into it as much as I would have liked to. What really changes is how, in 2017, when a lot of autistic self-advocates joined a lot of the other disability rights advocates in protesting the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. What happened is that gave them a lot of political cachet among Democrats, because now they were seen as being the people who were protesting in front of Mitch McConnell's office. They were seen as the people who in many ways saved, this landmark piece of Democratic legislation. So they built a lot of political capital and political power they otherwise didn't have. It's one thing to be in office and to have some kind of influence. It's another thing to be part of a larger coalition and to lend your specific talents to that group. So like one of my favorite stories is, one of my favorite signs that I saw during the Obamacare debates that disability rights advocates did was autistic people had a sign that says, "Please stop trying to repeal Obamacare so autistic people don't have to make any more phone calls." So that gave them increased political capital. And when you have increased political capital, then that means you're a constituency group that needs to be courted. And that's what you saw where I think a lot of language changed to the extent I didn't get to write about it in the book. I wrote it in an initial draft, but then we had to cut it. You had someone like, in 2008, you had Barack Obama talking about the skyrocketing rate of autism. In 2016 or in 2020, you saw Pete Buttigieg, or in 2019, you saw him say that we're seeing an increased prominence in autism because more people are open and being more candid about it. That is within a span of 11 years that you see a seismic shift in how political rhetoric has changed.
But there was another constituency that was especially active in the 1990s, which was a more negative one. And that was, I think, the parents that were holding on to this canard and falsehood that vaccines cause autism. And this was, again, similar to the elimination or curing language. This was a very mainstream position for a while where I think you write in the book about Tom Harkin of Iowa believing this. So similar to the other question, why do you think that this idea was able to gain legitimacy? And why do you think that this idea that vaccines cause autism got pushed to the fringes of society? And we'll talk in the next question about how it's come out of the shadows in a really bad way.
This is a really good question. So I think what happened is in the 1980s, you have to remember up until, and this is going to be a little bit of a tangent. So to get to the 1990s, we need to go back to the 1960s and the 1950s. It's important to remember that autism didn't have its own separate diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, otherwise known as the DSM, until 1980. Up until then, it was included as a symptom of schizophrenia. So what that meant was that in 1980, you see more people getting individually diagnosed with autism. Again, in, I think, 1987, you see the introduction of pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, also known as PDD-NOS. And then again, in around that time, Lorna Wing in the United Kingdom discovers Hans Asperger's old writings. Her husband, John, speaks German. They translated. You get Asperger's syndrome, which is included in the DSM in 1984. At the same time, you saw the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was reauthorized. It was initially the Education for Handicapped Children Act, because it was reauthorized as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And what happens is that for the first time, it includes autism as a disability, and therefore a disability that is entitled to a free, appropriate public education. That's a term a lot of people know, a FAPE. But that meant for the first time, autism was included. So what did that mean? That meant that now schools had to report to the federal government the amount of autistic people they were serving. So what that meant is that you naturally just saw more people, because you had increased and better diagnostic criteria and you had a government mandate, you saw an increase in prevalence of diagnoses, even if that didn't mean, even if that didn't necessarily mean that there was an increase in actual cases of autism. It just meant that and so what happened is in that vacuum, you saw a lot of people freaking out because autism was seen as something that only happened 1 in 10,000. It was seen as this very, very narrow thing. And so what happened is people started wondering what's causing it. And in that vacuum, you start to see Andrew Wakefield, who is a physician at the Royal Free Hospital in London, put out his initial study in the Lancet saying that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine causes leaky gut syndrome, which leads to chemicals going to the brain, and autism. And that gained a lot of cachet because it was this confluence of people were wondering what was causing autism. And he did what a lot of conspiracy theorists do. He offered a really simplistic solution to a very nuanced and complex answer. And it's also important to remember that up until the 1970s, parents were blamed for autism because there was this thing called refrigerator mothers. So you still had that overhang from that. So what it did is it allowed parents to absolve themselves from guilt and say, wow, it wasn't my fault this whole time. It was the damn doctors, or it was the the people like that, or it was them that caused it. And that it placed blame on somewhere else when really there was no one to quote unquote blame. People were just being born.
Yeah, but let's talk about how this anti-vaccine and autism confluence has really become very dangerous today.
Yes.
I'm going to read a quote from Sarah Luderman.
Yeah.
Who tweeted this out I think on Sunday, that
Yeah.
the autism community was a canary in the coal mine here,
Yes.
except we didn't actually adequately deal with the problem, wasted millions on anti-vaccine research, and tolerated all kinds of quackery. So what's now with the COVID-19 vaccine conspiracy theories and hesitancy, and what we saw with the vaccines equal autism falsehoods of the 90s?
Really good question, really important question, and I've said this before and I'll say it a million times. The autism vaccine panic of the 1990s and the 2000s is to the COVID-19 panic what The Hobbit is to the Lord of the Rings. It laid the groundwork. You wouldn't. So when Sarah says that, we allow for the most toxic things, what that means is that understand, Andrew Wakefield put out his study in 1998. He didn't get his medical license revoked, and that study in the Lancet wasn't retracted until 2010. So that was 12 years where this thing was out there. Now, there were people in between in the interim debunking it, but this thing was in the Lancet, and he was testifying before Congress. He testified before Congress multiple times. And it sowed the seeds of doubt and paranoia, and it was what led people to report autism cases to VAERS, VAERS. I forget what it stands for, but like vaccine adverse injury research, something like that.
We've heard a lot about VAERS recently.
Yeah, you hear about it now. Which what people don't realize is that VAERS is the equivalent is to medical research what a Yelp review is to food criticism. I forget, one of my friends said that. My friend Andrew said that. So it sowed the seeds, and it created this sense of doubt that vaccines were this public health good. And in fact, during the coronavirus pandemic, there was a great op-ed in the New York Times like 2-3 weeks ago, or even a month ago, I think, saying that like during the coronavirus pandemic, a lot of the anti-vaxxers from, the original vaccine panic about autism, saw the COVID-19 pandemic as an opportunity to be seized. They saw it as a time to sow doubt about vaccines and to spread misinformation and fear, to the extent that Andrew Wakefield now, he's going on QAnon podcasts. There is this weird now, almost a singularity of conspiracism and sowing of doubt and sowing of all this kind of misinformation that I don't think you otherwise that you wouldn't have seen had there not been that initial push in fear. A lot of polling has shown women being afraid of getting the vaccine. A perfect example of that is that a lot of the early mistrust about vaccines and autism was born on mom blogs and was born on because it was moms writing about their kids being autistic. That now there's some data, there's some research showing now that women are more willing to get vaccinated than men. That looks like the data has changed on that, but I think that you wouldn't have that initial push and that initial doubt and mistrust if there hadn't been the vaccine panic of the 1990s and the 2000s.
I want to provide maybe a non-political anecdote to showcase how deeply held beliefs are about misbeliefs about autism.
Yeah,
it involves Sia, who is somebody who I used to love as a musician. Probably one of my favorite pop musicians of the 2010s. And she created the greatest video, which was probably one of the best pieces of content about the Pulse nightclub shooting.
Yeah,
clearly she has some sensitivity to traditionally disadvantaged communities. But then she's responsible for this absolutely horrendous movie.
Yeah. Oh my God.
About a nonverbal autistic person who's not even played by
Maddie Ziegler is not autistic.
And the most startling thing to me is when Sia was challenged by autistic people, she was openly hostile.
Yeah.
So I want to how does this happen where people may seem really enlightened for other disadvantaged minorities, but have a total blind spot when it comes to autistic people? Yeah,
so this is a really good thing, and I'm really glad you brought this up. So I should say that Sia, Sia, that was a disaster. I watched that movie the day it came out, And I was, aside from it being really harmful about autism, like it also was just a really terrible movie on top of that. So like, I think it's important to distinguish the two. Like, it was a bad movie on the merits of film, and it was like really promoted a lot of really harmful ideas. But I think what it shows is that Sia was consulted. The fact that she didn't think to consult autistic people until after the movie came out, and the fact that shows that she was kind of cloistered, and she didn't think that, and she was getting bad information, and she was getting bad consulting about it, because she thought she was doing a great thing. She said that this was her love letter to autism. She said that she cared about it. But then, like, when autistic people said, no, this is really bad, she's like, well, maybe, and she said that, like, why didn't you cast an autistic actor? She's like, well, it was too hard to do that. And like, we had this autistic actress who wanted to do it, but she was too overwhelmed. And it was like, maybe that's a reflection on the fact that you didn't make the setting adaptable. And again, it was like, when somebody said, like, I've been trying to break through, and she's like, well, maybe you're just a bad actress. It was all like, I get that. I get what it's like to work on something for a long time and then have it be received terribly. I get it. Like, we as human beings don't necessarily like to receive bad criticism, especially something we put in our heart and our soul into. But the fact that she didn't understand that this would be the response shows that she wasn't listening to autistic people the whole time, shows that she was getting people who were probably just telling her, yeah, this is great, this is what's working. And that shows that she wasn't listening to autistic people. So it shows, it's really easy for me to make fun of Sia, and Lord knows I've done a ton of that on Twitter. But like, the point that I always make is that, like, there were people advising her who said, yeah, no, it's fine. Like, we don't need to consult autistic people. We don't need to cast autistic actors. The production company didn't say, don't you think we might need to, include autistic voices on this, or at least do a focus group screening with autistic people? The directors and the choreographers, there were so many things and so many times and moments where they could have put a red light to this that they didn't. And I think that's the bigger indictment, is that it got to this point and the movie came out, and then she got upset and she took umbrage at getting justifiable pushback, if you ask me, because I watched the movie and it was horrendous. But it was also, she didn't stop to think, because celebrities do kind of live in a different insular world, and they don't necessarily have experience listening to them. But at the same time, I would also argue that that's not really an excuse, because Pixar did one of the best portrayals of autism I've seen in a long time with their short film Loop. And, they cast an autistic girl to play the main character who is non-speaking. They listened to autistic advocates and autistic consultants, shows like Everything's Gonna Be Okay, consulted autistic people. But I think it just shows how misinformation leads to even really well-intentioned things. I don't think CEO had bad intentions. She just didn't listen, and she didn't want. And on top of that, I don't think that she realized that autistic people have their own agency and their own voices, and that their voices and their needs are legitimate. So I think that's ultimately what happened.
Now, I want to talk about another really important chapter in your book, and it involves race and racism and the racial gaps when it comes to autism. And we kind of have seen this in St. Louis. I live in St. Louis County, and I want to be nuanced here. St. Louis County does have the largest population of African Americans in the state, but it's still a 70% white county. And we have probably one of the best funded special education systems, I don't want to say in America, but probably in the Midwest, with the special school district.
Yeah, I heard about it.
Across the border in St. Louis City, which is a largely Black school district, and they're not part of SSD, and they have a lot of trouble retaining special education people. And I think that is clearly a racial equity issue.
Yeah.
Pretty obviously.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I want to ask you, do you see this types of disparities when it comes to providing education for disabled people elsewhere? And how do these racial disparities, in the way autistic people are perceived, again, manifest themselves in really dangerous ways?
That happens in so many places, outside of Missouri. So many autistic people I interviewed, autistic people of color, were diagnosed when they became adults. And can you imagine going K through 12 and even undergrad not knowing that you're autistic? Plenty of them get, or because of perceptions about children of color and Black kids. A lot of Black kids get diagnosed with conduct disorders or behavioral disorders or kind of defiance disorders, or they're seen as just having poor behavior, or they're reprimanded. And it's not seen as they might be having a developmental disability and that they might need help. And I think the other thing is that you see a gap. I think that the gap can be anywhere. There was a study that came out last year showing the gap can be anywhere from like 6 months to a few years. So that even when autistic people do get diagnosed, they get diagnosed much later than their white counterparts. And this is to say that because our perceptions of autism are shaped largely by what it looks like in white people, and particularly white males, that shapes who gets diagnosed. So it's important to go back. The early 1943 study that was done on autism in the United States by a guy named Leo Connor, who was a professor at Johns Hopkins University, he found the initial 11 children he surveyed, 9 of them were white and Anglo-Saxon, and 2 of them were Jewish. So what that means is that the template that we have for autism today is shaped very much by that. And then on top of that, 8 of the 11 children were boys, 3 of them were girls. So already there, the schema and who we perceive as who can be autistic is shaped by, it's the idea that it can only be somebody who's likely white, and more often than not, somebody who's male. Meanwhile, in Vienna, Hans Asperger, he thought that it only affected, as you can imagine, Vienna at the time was a very homogeneous country, and he thought for a while that it didn't affect girls. So our perception already from the gate is shaped by this. And the gap is closing a little bit, or tremendously to the point that it's only like there's like a 1.2 ratio, the amount of diagnosis is like 1.2%, but that only happened in 2016. And on top of that, there still is a big gap with Latinos and Asian Americans, just because of the language gap. And a lot of the tools that are used to diagnose are still in English. So there still is a very big racial and gender gap, I should say.
A couple more questions before we throw it up to the audience questions.
Sure.
This is more of a present day question that I'd really like your opinion on. So I've been following the ACLU trying to sustain mask mandates by using the ADA. And the ADA, and correct me if I'm paraphrasing this incorrectly, it's supposed to guarantee equal access to education for people with disabilities. And I think what they're arguing is, and they're using sometimes people with ADHD or autism, but also other, physical disabilities as well, that a lack of a mask mandate makes it less safe for disabled people. And also, I think that they are implicitly saying that, if the school shuts down and they have to go remote, then somebody, say, with autism and ADHD are not going to have equal access. And it got me thinking, though, because there were a lot of school districts that went fully remote and didn't provide an in-person option. And I want to make it clear that I don't want to prescribe a one-size-fits-all solution for all autistic people, because that is like lesson number 1. Don't put all autistic people in a box.
No,
I didn't see the ACLU come out when schools closed and said, remote schooling is an ADA violation for some autistic people, even though some may not. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, what do you think about this? And do you think that it's sometimes a little, I guess, wobbly or sketchy for people to use the ADA to maybe color their own worldview? As well as rather than being consistent and trying to actually provide equal access to everybody.
I think that what you're seeing is that I think that there are, I agree that I think it might be a little, one-sided, or the idea that because there were plenty of, and I should say that different disabled people benefited and got fewer benefits, depending on what style that they were learning during the pandemic. There was a great piece in the New York Times that showed that some disabled people got better education during the pandemic, but then some, with ADHD and autism didn't perform as well. So I think I see what the ACLU is doing, and I see what civil liberty groups and local civil liberty and disability advocacy groups are doing. I think it might be a little bit legally easier, though again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm glad I didn't go to law school. But I think that might be the rationale, is that they're concerned about being around other people, might be the concern. But I've been following these cursorily, so I can't say enough about them. But I think that, yeah, it goes to show that there definitely was a big learning gap for some disabled people, not all, but a lot, but some disabled people during the COVID-19 pandemic. Plenty of them didn't get a lot of the resources they needed. Plenty of them didn't get a FAPE. Plenty of them didn't get the education that they were entitled to. In fact, I know some who just skipped a year. So that's not it's definitely one of those things that I don't know if it might be one-sided, it might not be. Again, I haven't been following it enough, but I think that it does definitely show. I think also it shows how difficult it is to enforce some things versus the other, and and I think it also shows that when you have something like that, it's also important to remember the ADA. To your point, the ADA is not an active law. There's no ADA agency. It's not like the EPA. It's not like the Department of Education. There's not a bureaucracy. It relies on lawsuits, and it relies on individual actions to file a lawsuit. So that makes it a lot harder for there to be kind of a collective action like there would be for, like, if there was an environmental regulation or something like that.
So this will be my last question before we turn it over. And just as a reminder to people who are watching on Facebook, just type in your questions for Eric, and Shane will pop on the screen and ask them for you. I got to say, I think one of the most striking things about this book, it's really beautifully written. I love how it uplifts other people's voices and really tries to get a diverse swath of people. The other thing that was notable is you even touch on it a couple times, that you did not want to make this into the Eric Garcia autobiography, even though you filled in points of your life. I'm interested from somebody who also identifies as a writer. Why did you decide to make this decision to shining a spotlight primarily on others rather than it just be like a memoir?
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I are both reporters, right? And I think that there's just this general curiosity. And I think that I don't have anything against a lot of against most autism memoirs. A lot of them are great. I'm reading a few right now. There's a really good one that's out in the UK right now. It should be coming out of the US now soon. It's called Drama Queen by Sarah Gibbs. But I think that generally my job is, I'm a political reporter, and I was just like, and anytime I started writing, anytime I felt this kind of impulse to write about myself, I was like, wait, is this really, am I just thinking this, or did this just happen to me, or does this happen elsewhere? And then the thing that led me that I then thought was, well, if this happened to me, or if I experienced it, then this must have happened to someone else. And I think that my feeling was, I was like, I don't want just my story. I worried that just telling my story would color people's perceptions as this is what happens with autism, rather than I was more like, wait, I'm curious. Almost every time I started to write about myself, I was more curious, like, wait, did this happen to other people? Or was it, and if it didn't, then okay, how is this different from everybody else? So it was more and more, I just became more curious that I realized, okay, there are other autistic people, and their lives are very different from mine, and in other ways they're very, very similar to mine. And then on top of that, what I realized is that I was able to succeed because of very specific, very deliberate policy goals. And the other thing that I realized is that a lot of other autistic people were, languished or had difficulty because of lack and gaps in policies. And I thought that was a much more interesting story than anything I could tell, just on my own accord.
All right, Shane, I'm going to throw it back to you, and hopefully we have some good audience questions.
We have a really good audience here. We do have a question. So yes, if you are watching, which I know you are, be sure to type up your questions in the comments. I had several questions, but Jason, you were such a fantastic interviewer that you asked almost all of my questions, like almost exactly on a couple of questions. So I'm really thankful for this conversation. It was really enlightening. And let's get to some audience questions. Shirley asks, did your perception of yourself change as you were writing the book?
Yes, it did. So yeah, it absolutely did. I think that what I learned was, uh, you know, one second. So yeah, I think that what it taught me was that I started out thinking that a lot of my experiences were very individualized. Then what I realized is that they were pretty similar to everybody else's. So, like for example, my friend John Marble, who I profile in the book, he compares being autistic to being French, and he says that if a Catholic, not that there's that if you are a fashion designer in Paris, your experience is going to be very different from being a Catholic nun in Bordeaux. But there's still this, if you're sitting at a cafe in, say, the Champagne region, they're still going to have some kind of esprit de corps from being French. And I think what I realized and what I learned was that a lot of very, very things that I thought were weird about me or that made me kind of an oddball were actually part of these larger traits of being autistic. One of my favorite things that I did when I researched this book was when I went to Michigan, and I went to this retreat out in the woods in Michigan at this used to be a Jewish day camp, but it was for autistic people, autistic adults, and we had the most wonderful time playing Scrabble and playing games and talking. And what I noticed was after like 3 or 4 hours, all of us our guards started to come down. And we were able to start stimming and rocking back and forth. And we started, enthusiastically info dumping and talking about what we loved about things like that. So and I realized, it was kind of like autistic code switching in a weird way. We were allowed to be ourselves, so we were ourselves. The other thing was I realized is that there's no right or wrong way to be autistic. I think one of the things that, even though I grew up, I was diagnosed when I was younger, I always kind of worried that because I think when I initially started writing about autism, I was like, I don't know enough about this, or I don't know enough about that, or I don't understand this, or I don't understand that. I often wondered that I wasn't the right kind of autistic. And what I've realized since is that there's no right or wrong way to be autistic.
Lauren is asking, what can developmental pediatricians do to help change the conversation on autism? Most parents whose children receive an ASD diagnosis are told, go get ABA with an asterisk. And that's about it. And the asterisk says, I realize ABA is a loaded topic between parents and actually autistic people.
That's a good question. So that is a really good question. I think that what can developmental pediatricians do to change the conversation on autism? I think the most important thing is to listen more to what the parents are saying or what autistic kids themselves are saying, if they can speak. And even then, their parents can find ways to communicate what they need if they can't speak. But also focus on what is going to be the thing that maximizes their individual potential and what allows them to live the most stable and happy and secure life, less on hitting the kind of milestones that neurotypically developing kids will have. So I think focusing on things like, instead of focusing on when do they start walking or when do they start talking, focusing more on like, are they able to articulate when they're hungry? Are they able to articulate when they're tired? Are they able to, and how are they able to do that? And making sure that you listen to them and making sure that they have a means of articulating and showing that. And I think also focusing on, to the point about go get ABA. Yeah, ABA is a really controversial thing, but more than that, I think, I think more than that, I think what's important to recognize is that that's often the only game in town. That's often the only thing that insurers will cover. So when parents get the diagnosis and say, get the ADA diagnosis, say, go get ABA, that's about it. That's because that's the only thing insurers can cover. And doctors often feel like that's the only thing that they can do. They're like, what else are you going to do? And, I interviewed autistic people. I interviewed an autistic BCBA, but a lot of autistic people really don't like it. But I think that more than that, I think it's indicative of a lack of imagination that this is the only thing that a lot of states or state insurers are willing to cover. And even then, it was a real fight to get that covered under insurance. So again, I think it just shows scarcity and a lack of imagination from both insurers, clinicians, doctors, and educators. So that's it. That doesn't directly answer your question, but it's a roundabout way of doing that.
Joni is asking, when applying for jobs, did you reveal your autism status?
Oof. You guys are getting into it.
We have a really good audience. Like,
yeah,
I make promises to authors that I'm thankful of these.
I didn't. So this is the long short of it. I didn't when I started working. When I had applied for part-time jobs, I put down on online job applications that I was disabled and I never got a call back. So when I graduated from college and I started applying for jobs, I was just like, I'm not going to really put that down, because I just didn't want to be judged as different from anybody else. And it made things really hard. I got the jobs, but on top of that, but as a result of not disclosing that I was autistic, I didn't get the kind of accommodations that could have helped tremendously. At the same time, I remember when I was talking with Marcel Champy in the book, and I talk about this in the book. She said she's never not regretted coming out as autistic or disclosing that she was autistic, because it automatically, employers start to think, okay, how much is it going to cost to accommodate you? How much is it how are they going to blend with the rest of the employees? How is this going to help for company cohesion? So I don't want to say, so I can't really recommend one or the other, because because I think that doesn't, because I think each thing is individual and I can't really recommend one or the other. So it's so as much as I would like to say, oh, you should disclose or you can't disclose, it's really dependent on the situation. And again, and on top of that, it's asymmetrical information because you don't know what the employer is going to say.
Yeah. And I mean, that's part of the reason why we need better advocacy, because that support needs to be there, built into the application system, the employment system. So, yeah. Amanda is asking, my oldest child is autistic and they think that my youngest child may be also. I agree that it's possible, but so far the youngest hasn't had issues at school, which is how the oldest got a diagnosis. Do you think it's important to get a diagnosis regardless?
Yeah, my answer is yeah. I think that they could be. I think that the reason why I say that is that I understand is that a lot of times there is a double-edged sword, because you don't want to subject your kid to a lot of traumatic treatment. But on the other end, the only way you can get the access to services when you're in school is if you have the piece of paper. So, but more than that, I think but more than the piece of paper, I think what it offers is it offers clarity. And the clarity is going to outlast the clarity is going to outlast any benefits that like having that piece of paper is, because once you know that you're autistic, I cannot tell you how many people I've interviewed or I've talked to or I've spoken to. I said once they got the autism diagnosis, they were like, oh, I know what I'm working with. I know what I have. That can't be, I almost want to say that that's more important than getting the services. Not that the services aren't important, but it's the foundation for which the services can be built on. You know what I mean? You can't know what you need if you're not aware that you're working with something different. So once you get the foundation of the diagnosis, then everything else, not to say that everything's going to be perfect, because it's not, but then you know what you need to go, and you can at least try to build a roadmap and try and fail and try again. But really good question. Really good question.
With each of you working kind of in journalism, I'm curious, this is my question. We've talked about how many various misconceptions there are through media, through reporting, through kind of everything. How do you personally, and this could be for Jason as well, correct those misconceptions on a personal level. So if we are interacting with a friend or family member, how do we go about doing that as maybe various neurodiverse people or neurotypical people?
Yeah. Jason, you want to go ahead or before me, or?
You can go first, Eric.
Yeah, so I think the one thing is recognizing, is always being curious. That is a really important thing, is always being willing to admit that you're wrong. Like, I'm going to completely admit I got things wrong, and I continue to get things wrong, every time about autism. And I'm sure, and there were things that I didn't get in this book. And there are going to be things that I'm sure that later on I'm going to learn more stuff about autism. I'm going to be like, oh man, I should have included this, So I think having an open mind and an open heart, and being willing to change and willing to adapt and willing to listen and willing to speak to as many autistic people as possible. I interviewed, I think I must have talked to 15 or 20 autistic people for this book. I talked to a lot of people. And talking to as many people as much as possible and recognizing I could be wrong, those two kind of things have been my guiding lights, is recognizing that I'm not an authority, that I'm not the be-all end-all authority, and that I need to listen more than I speak.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. I'll just use my experience of reporting in Ferguson. I'm a white male, heterosexual male. I have no idea what it's like to be a black man who has been hassled by police. So what I did was I just listened to a lot of people that had those experiences and tried to use my platform as a reporter for a fairly prominent public radio station to, amplify their experience. And, sometimes their experiences challenged my own worldview on things, and they fundamentally changed how I think about race in America, and how racism has been probably the biggest reason why a lot of people in this country are where they are right now.
Yeah.
So I think that it kind of goes that's not exactly the same thing, but I wanted to just point that out, that especially when you're a reporter from a fairly privileged standpoint like I am, the best thing that you can do is listen and be empathetic when people are telling you their experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what it does is it recognizes that the thing, I think it's easy to, when you're like me and you work in newspapers, or like Jason, you work on radio, it's easy for people to think that we're the authorities or we're the experts, or to think that, or for us to think that we're the people who have a monopoly on the truth, when really what we're really doing, and what we should be doing in our jobs as journalists, as conveying truths and trying to tell what other people know, and recognizing that we can get things wrong, but also we can get things right. And where do we get things right? Where do we get things wrong? Try again the next day. Try to listen more and try to learn more. So that's what I was saying.
Now, but before we sign off, I do want to ask this question. What do you think about Missouri politics? I'm interested in an outsider's view of what I have to deal with on a daily basis.
I follow you, so that's one thing, and I follow a lot of people at the Kansas City Star and St. Louis Public Radio and all these other outlets. I think it's just fascinating to see that. I think that a lot of people would make the mistake to think that Missouri is trending rightward, and make no mistake, it is. Politically, it's rightward, and statewide elected officials are rightward. But I think that it's kind of the same thing as where I grew up when I went to college in North Carolina, people thinking that, it's all Republican, or where I grew up in California, that it's all Democratic. I think that there are a lot of smaller internecine fights, and then even there are fights within the same party, as you covered Eric Greitens' kind of fall from power. And as he is not really that much of a fan of a guy I see on the Senate a lot, Senator Josh Hawley. So I think that it's more than just this monolithic kind of thing that there's little many things that kind of create this amalgamation of this place called Missouri.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both for this incredible conversation.
Thank you.
Eric, I know that there's a lot going on in the Capitol today, so certainly you probably took out some very valuable time of your day today to join us. So
Thank
I'm
you.
very thankful. I dropped a link to the book, which is on our shelves now and available at Left Bank Books for in-store curbside pickup, in-store shopping, or for mailing anywhere in the country. So if you are not local to St. Louis and would like a copy of this book, we can mail you a copy.
Also, DM me or follow me on Twitter. And if you got a copy of the book, if you bought it from this, DM me. If you pay for shipping, I will sign your book.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Jason, thank you as always for an incredible interview. And
thank you, Jason. Thank you, Left Bank. Thank you for everybody for a great day.
Yeah. All right. And to the audience watching, see you next time.
See you next time.